Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take, a bunch of sources, articles, research, notes from maybe a really fascinating lecture, and we pull out the key knowledge, the surprising bits, to give you a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed.
And we're here to guide you through all that material, help you see what's really important and, well, why it matters.
Exactly. And today, we've got something that feels like uncovering hidden history, like literally carved right into stone. We're diving into notes and transcript bits from a lecture by an expert on Christian architecture in the Caucasus.
Yeah, we're looking specifically at the stone decoration. They call it the architectural plastic on Christian churches there, mostly from the 10th to 13th centuries.
But not just the standard stuff, right? We're talking about really unusual images, kind of traditional motives stuck in the stone that seem, well, surprising. Things you wouldn't automatically expect on a church. Yeah.
What are they? Where did they even come from? And, how do they end up on sacred Christian buildings? That's really the mystery we're trying to unpack here.
Okay, I'm ready. Let's dive in and see what these stones can tell us about this fascinating mix of beliefs and traditions.
Okay, so to start, the sources really paint a picture of the Caucasus region itself as, well, absolutely unique. It's described as a treasure trove.
A treasure trove? How so? What makes it so special?
Well, because it's a place where really ancient traditions, beliefs, even like material forms that might have just faded or been lost everywhere else, they've been remarkably preserved there. It gives us a window, a look into humanity's deep past, almost like holding up a mirror to our own history. It's even been called a connecting thread.
So it's not just geography, it's culturally and historically a place where these deep layers of the past are still kind of alive and accessible.
Precisely. So our focus is Christian architecture along the greater Caucasus mountain range during the post-Arab period, that's roughly the 10th through 13th centuries. And specifically, the decoration carved into the stone.
Okay, but why focus on this period and this material?
Well, the 10th century, it marks a pretty significant point. It comes after what's often called the Dark Ages, or, the era of Arab invasions across the region. This was a time of disruption, big upheaval, a kind of forced pause and rethink.
A break from what came before then.
Yeah. The earlier Christian period was maybe more universal, more directly tied to late antiquity classical styles.
Yeah.
You might see it in fancy mosaic floors, for instance. But from the 10th century on, there was this revival. And while it was still broadly, Byzantine in culture, different regions started turning inward, drawing on their own really local autochthonous roots.
Like different branches of the same tree starting to grow in their own unique ways.
That's a good way to put it. And along with that, the way churches were decorated actually changed. Instead of covering huge inside spaces, the decoration started to cluster on what the sources call transition points.
Transition points, like places you pass through.
Exactly. Door portals, window frames, the bases of domes, altar screens, places marking entry or exit or separation inside the sacred space. These outside and entry-exit spots became the main focus for decoration.
And the source suggests this wasn't just like pretty patterns.
Oh, not at all. The strong hypothesis is that these images were primarily protective or apotropaic signs. They were meant to ward off evil, provide safeguarding, a kind of everyday magic, as the lecture calls it, built right into the church architecture.
Ah, okay.
And this idea isn't just in the Caucasus. You see similar functions for decoration at these kinds of points across the Eastern Christian world, and even some parallels in Western Romanesque art.
So the decoration had a really practical, perceived protective job, especially where the sacred space met the outside, or where you moved between different levels of holiness inside.
That's the key idea here. And the study covered a pretty wide area, parts of modern Abkhazia, Ossetia, Georgia, Armenia, and nearby historical areas now in Turkey. About 75 different sites were looked at.
Did it all look the same? Or was there variation across that area?
Oh, definitely variation. Places with more direct contact with, say, the Byzantine center, especially coastal areas through sea routes, they showed stronger Byzantine influence, as you'd expect. But the mountain regions, the more isolated spots.
That's where the really unique stuff probably shows up.
That's what it looks like. Features that seem potentially linked to very old local beliefs, or maybe influenced by ancient caravan routes that snake through the mountains.
Okay, so we're looking at these traditional, often surprising, non-standard images carved into churches from this time, usually at protective spots. What are some of the really striking examples? Let's start with the animals, the figurative stuff.
Right. A really big category is horned skulls, particularly bulls and rams.
Horned animals.
Yeah.
Yeah, they feel like such ancient symbols of power, don't they, across so many cultures.
They really are. The sources point out the difference between bull horns, more moon-shaped or spiral, and ram horns, which are tightly spiraled. Bulls, associated with strength, ancient cult, even authority horns used in crowns. But their persistence as protective signs is what's really key here.
And you see that outside of churches, too, that protective idea.
Absolutely. Modern ethnography shows bull skulls still being put on fields or fences in places like Dagestan and Abkhazia, even today, specifically for protection.
Wow. That connection across centuries is amazing. So we see this tradition show up directly on the churches themselves.
We do. One really, truly striking example is a Prairie church in Svaneti, 11th century. You go up to the east facade, the main holiest front of the church, and there, instead of crosses, you find a set of carved horned skulls.
Yeah.
Deer, antelope, and bull.
Wait, instead of crosses? On the main facade, that feels incredibly bold, almost defiant.
It is a profound choice, yeah. It signals just how deep the power and importance of these traditional protective symbols was, placed right at arguably the most significant spot on the whole building. Another example, Svetoslav Cathedral in Moscow, Georgia, a major spiritual center. On the fence around the cathedral, over the 11th century gate, there are two bullheads.
Another transition point. The gate. Makes sense.
Exactly. And a bullhead pops up on a window at Sanahin Monastery in Armenia, 10th century. These aren't just isolated finds. The practice had ancient roots. You see it in things like an Egyptian amulet from way, way back, or a Spanish roll mask priests used. It shows that deep cross-cultural link between horned animals and the sacred.
Okay, what about rams?
Ram heads are just as important, especially in the Caucasus with its history of livestock farming and, of course, the whole golden fleece myth tied to Colchis. The ram is connected to the Ossetian concept of farn.
Farn, what's that about?
It represents things like grace, abundance, prosperity, and fertility. It's explicitly linked to prayers for children in Ossetian traditional shrines even today.
Ah, so a symbol of lineage, blessing, continuity?
Yes, exactly. And we see ram heads crowning the east facade of Ili Church in Svaneti, also 11th century, placed very similarly to the skulls at Aprari. Ram heads are on the bell tower of Zamona Monastery in South Ossetia, though that's a bit later, 15th century, showing how long this visual tradition lasted.
And there's that one example that shows just how incredibly deep these roots go, isn't there?
There is. It's a simplified ram image on the drum of Largvis Church in South Ossetia, 14th century. And it looks strikingly similar to designs found on Bronze Age figulae, pins or brooches from the Kabardino-Kuder culture in that same area.
Hold on. A carving on a 14th century church, it literally looks like an art form from maybe 3,000 years earlier from the same place. That visual link is just powerful proof of cultural continuity.
It's one of the most compelling connections the sources bring up. And notice how these animal heads are often just isolated motifs, right? They're not part of bigger Christian stories like the Lamb of God. This really suggests their meaning is tied to these older, local, traditional ideas, not just Christian symbolism. The fact that ram horns or shapes derived from them are like a constant feature in traditional Caucasus home decoration. That further backs up this idea of the home influencing the church. Okay, so from the powerful and horned to maybe the seemingly more humble but still sacred snakes and fish. Yeah, the snake holds a particularly sacred place in Caucasus tradition, even the poisonous ones. Finding one in your house is seen as a good omen for the family line. Harming one is believed to bring a curse. That's a serious belief. Oh, very much so. There's an Ossetian legend about snakes bringing a protective bead. And we find snakes on churches, curled in rings on a window frame at Sagamo Church in Georgia, 10th century. Or a snake with a round object at Pavnizi Church, also a 10th century. Maybe that's the legendary bead.
That definitely adds another layer of meaning to the image, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But there's one snake image that sounds really unique.
Ah, the double-headed snake with two rings.
Yes. Tell me about that one.
It's on a 10th century window frame relief from the Dorvis in South Ossetia. The lecture suggests the doubling two heads, two rings was intentional, probably to amplify its protective function, especially since it was placed above an opening, a vulnerable spot.
So like doubling down on the protective magic.
That's the interpretation, yeah. And what makes this even more significant is the connection to a lost plate from Kavaisa, just a few kilometers away. This plate had the exact same double-headed snake with rings.
The exact same unusual image.
Yes, but it was part of a bigger picture.
Yeah.
The prophet Jonah coming out of the belly of the whale.
Jonah and the whale. But the whale is a double-headed snake. Okay,
Yeah.
that is definitely not standard Christian art.
It's incredibly rare. The iconography shows like human body parts emerging from the creature's mouth. This specific, really unusual depiction is found in Asia Minor in the early 4th century. Then it seems to just vanish, only to pop up again surprisingly in the 10th century Caucasus.
Why would they mix Jonah, who's a Christian symbol of resurrection, with this ancient, powerful, possibly protective double-headed snake?
Well, in Christian tradition, Jonah's 3 days in the belly prefigures Christ's resurrection. On that Kvaisa plate, the person who commissioned it was shown presenting a model of a church. They weren't just giving it to a snake or even just to Jonah. They were dedicating it to this combined, incredibly potent symbol of resurrection and deep-rooted protective power. It's a really fascinating, very specific example of how older symbols got pulled in and reframed within a Christian context that was unique to this region.
That really highlights the blend well. And fish often appear with snakes, you said.
Yes. Fish are another ancient sacred sign. You often find them linked to Bronze Age artifacts and also Hellenistic protective mosaics. Seeing them with snakes on these churches just reinforces that connection to older layers of belief.
So beyond specific animals, the sources mention syncretic or hybrid creatures, things that mix parts of different animals.
Exactly. Often shown in a sort of flat graphic style. There's been debate, was this just lack of skill or was it intentional? But specialists like Alexander Yuryevich Skatkov, who's mentioned in the source, they conclude the hybridity itself is the sacred part. It was done on purpose. It connects back to ancient traditions where composite beings think of the Sphinx guarding sacred entrances were seen as having special power guarding holy places.
Ah, so the combination of features itself gives them that protective or sacred meaning.
That seems to be the idea. Think about the figures coming out of a cross on a window top at Anacopia Church in Abkhazia, 10th or early 11th century. Based on the context in the Greek inscription there, they're interpreted as a lion and a bull, maybe representing Isaiah's prophecy of peaceful coexistence in paradise.
A lion and a bull peacefully together.
Yes. And there's a cross in the Sukhumi Museum showing similar figures where the lion is gently touching the bull's horns, really emphasizing that harmony. Other strange hybrid creatures show up on churches like UBC, late 9th century, and Akvelpe, 10th century. It seems these aren't images of conflict, but maybe of a powerful, almost paradise-like state shown through these combined forms.
Fascinating. Okay, moving from animals and hybrids to maybe something even stranger, anthropomorphic images or liches, faces or masks.
Yes, human faces carved into the churches, often in really unexpected spots. The sources suggest this might come from a different tradition, possibly Persian or Iranian influence.
Where do we see this?
Well, the famous Holy Cross Church on Akhtamar Island in Armenia, 10th century, that's a prime example. It has this gult of hunting trophies relief with human heads mixed in with animal heads. And amazingly, under the main cornice, there's a second belt with 42 distinct, varied human faces.
42 different faces. That's incredibly specific, almost like portraits.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it's not just Akhtamar. You find similar embedded stone heads on Georgian churches, too, like Baghrati Cathedral.
Are these heads just decorative, or do they have a deeper meaning, like the animals seem to?
The connection to ethnographic work, especially by Padma Takhtanayeva, points strongly towards a protective function. She documented stone human heads and animal heads too, deliberately embedded as protective signs in traditional village architecture in Dagestan on bridges, house entrances. It's a tradition that, persists today in some areas.
So the practice of embedding heads for protection on buildings seen on these ancient churches is something that actually continued in local traditional homes. That's a really powerful link.
It shows how deeply rooted these traditions were. The origin probably goes back much further. You see it in places like Hatra, a Parthian site from the 1st, 2nd century AD, where heads decorated city gates. It suggests a broad, sacred, and protective significance. The human face as an amulet is also a traditional Iranian idea.
And there's that modern example mentioned that sounds almost unbelievable.
Oh yeah, the pig head. Embedded in a mosque minaret in Gelkin village, South Dagestan.
A pig head on a mosque minaret. That seems fundamentally against Islamic tradition.
It absolutely is. But it shows just how incredibly strong and stable these traditional material forms and the beliefs behind them were. They lasted for centuries, embedded not just in Christian churches, but also in mosques. The sources mention that some of the more, let's say, odious heads were only removed quite recently, like in the early 2000s, by radical groups. Shows they were there until very, very recently.
Wow, that single example just speaks volumes about the resilience of these deep cultural layers, popping up in places you'd least expect based on formal religion.
It's a truly remarkable testament to the power of that traditional culture.
Okay, so we've looked at the figurative images, the animals, the hybrids, the faces. What about the other big category mentioned? Ornaments.
Right, ornaments. They're everywhere in traditional culture
Sure.
and often carry protective meanings. Think about embroidery on clothes, that kind of thing. The study identified three main types used on these churches.
First one.
Geometric ornaments, simple shapes like rhombi or dots. You find these on sacred niches like at Beta in South Ossetia or on church facades like at Disiv in Georgia. Sometimes they're even explicitly combined with other amulet signs, like a hand holding an iron object.
So even basic shapes could act as protection.
Seems so, yes. They have parallels in simple paintings in places like Cappadocia and also amulets from Armenia. The sources even connect geometric patterns to sacred ideas and really ancient traditions, mentioning the Etruscan goddess Fatica.
Okay, and the other two types.
Rosettes, basically flower motifs and woven or ribbon ornaments, interlaced bands. Now, these were common in the wider Byzantine world, and they appear en masse on Caucasus churches from the 10th century onwards, especially on altar screens and facades.
So these seem more directly connected to the bigger Byzantine art world.
Yes, but the sources highlight a key discovery that reveals their local sacred meaning too. At a place called Gasitlinskoye Gorodische in Dagestan, a 10th century settlement, no evidence of Christianity. They found a stele in a grain storage pit.
In a grain storage.
Yeah, and a grain storage is often a really important place, sometimes serving as a kind of house shrine, the most sacred spot in a traditional home. It connects survival with the sacred. And this stele they found there, it was decorated with rosettes and woven ornaments.
The same ornaments found on the churches.
Exactly the same.
Hmm.
This find was crucial because it showed these weren't just random bits of architecture or just Byzantine imports. They were special sacred plates or maybe altars used in traditional homes or community spaces. It confirmed these specific ornaments already had sacred meaning in the local non-Christian culture from the same time period.
That's incredibly strong evidence. So these ornaments weren't just adopted as decoration, they were adopted because they already had a deep sacred significance locally that resonated with the idea of decorating a sacred building.
Precisely. And the source notes that later, in the 14th, 15th century Caucasus, ornament could become the main decoration on things like altar screens, sometimes even pushing out figurative art altogether.
And how far back do these ornaments go, their origins?
Oh, way back. Ornamental crosses are seen in Cappadocia from the 6th, 7th century. There's a 3rd century AD ritual silver plate from the Mysian treasure, late antiquity, that shows rosettes and woven ornament around a tree of life. That shows their sacred use long before this period. Elements from earlier floor mosaics later got transferred to stone decoration too.
And the deepest roots, even further back.
The source suggests origins possibly reaching back to Hittite culture, citing an example from Samuel. So it indicates a tradition that maybe existed, perhaps faded a bit, but then came back strong in Hellenism and again in the Middle Byzantine period, spreading really strongly into the Caucasus, where it clearly clicked with existing local sacred practices.
Okay, this is where it all connects, right? We've looked at the animals, the faces, the ornaments, many of them unusual, often placed at those transition points, and seeming to have protective meanings, echoing traditions outside formal Christian art. How do we pull this all together? What does it tell us about Christian culture in this region?
Okay, yeah, let's synthesize this. What this deep dive really shows is that Christian churches in this specific part of the Caucasus weren't just like passive receivers of Byzantine style. They were actively pulling in elements from various really deep influences. Local archaeological traditions going way back, broader Byzantine artistic trends, and yeah, potentially Persian influences, especially with those faces.
And the common thread linking a lot of these unusual motifs seems to be their job, their function.
Yes, their main role seems to have often been as protective, apotropaic signs, placed strategically at windows, doors, altars the spots seen as needing safeguarding.
So it's about protection, a kind of sacred, everyday magic built right into the architecture of God's house.
Exactly. But the core hypothesis, the really powerful insight from the lecture, I think, is that the whole idea of decorating God's house in this specific way is deeply connected to the local tradition of decorating the ancestral home.
Decorating the church using the same kind of thinking and symbols you'd use for your own family home.
In essence, yeah, the Caucasus has this incredibly strong lineage consciousness. Central to that is the cult of ancestors and the vital importance of the ancestral home. It's a space shared by both the living and the dead kin. This way of thinking was clearly very much alive in the 10th to 13th centuries, and honestly, in some areas, it still persists today.
Like, gathering at the ancestral home is still a really big cultural thing.
Absolutely. So decorating the church was, in this context, kind of like decorating God's home, using the same protective and meaningful visual language, the same principles that you'd use for your own lineage home. It reflects this powerful, ongoing cultural mindset.
So the strength and stability of that underlying local tradition actually provided the artistic language for the Christian revival after the disruptions of the Arab period happened.
That's the argument, yes. When those older, more universal classical traditions got disrupted, the strong, stable local culture provided the artistic impulse and the specific forms that shaped the revival from the 10th century onwards.
This is where it really comes together then. This region, while definitely part of the wider Byzantine Christian world, developed its own unique self-identity within that world.
And that unique identity is beautifully expressed through its art and architecture, specifically because of the enduring strength and persistence of these underlying local traditions. Traditions stretching back not just centuries, but millennia.
This is incredible. It really shifts how you might look at these ancient buildings. So what does this all mean for you, listening to this deep dive right now?
Well, it means that when you look at a church, or really any historical building, there can be layers of meaning embedded in it that stretch back thousands of years, drawing on beliefs and traditions far older than the building itself, even older than the main religion it represents.
It gives you a way to sort of read the architectural plastic, as they call it, to look at these carvings and see not just the formal religious symbols, but echoes of ancient protective magic, signs of lineage and identity, and really a testament to the sheer resilience of local culture facing huge historical changes.
It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just a straight line. You know, it's more like a complex tapestry where the deep past can keep influencing the present in a really tangible, visible ways.
Thank you. That was a truly fascinating deep dive into the stone decorations of Caucasus churches. It really revealed surprising connections between ancient local beliefs, traditional home decoration, and Christian art in this unique part of the world.
Yeah, it shows how those connecting threads from the past aren't just abstract ideas. They're literally carved into the fabric of the sacred buildings.
And the fact that these ancient symbols endured, the strength of those lineage traditions, persisting even within major world religions like Christianity and Islam, it really highlights just how deeply rooted culture can be and makes you wonder, what other powerful echoes from the past might still be subtly shaping the world around you today in ways you've never even noticed before.
Definitely something to think about next time you look at something old.
Absolutely. What stood out to you most in this deep dive?